Thank you so much. I can promise you the lecture is better than the one 4 years ago would have been. So thank you so much to James Wetzel and the Catholic Artists Society for the invitation to speak here. Thanks also to the General Theological Seminary and the School of Sacred Music for this space and the beautiful context for this talk. I'm delighted to be here to get to speak on the topic of Catholic women in the arts through the centuries, and specifically, I'm going to speak on the theme of Catholic women's contributions to the visual arts, which I regard as an underappreciated tradition on two fronts. So, on one hand, the contributions of women generally to painting and sculpture prior to the 20th century, especially, are still coming to be more fully appreciated by art historians and museum curators, following a surge of interest in this area over the past several decades. The presence of Catholic women among such women of the past who contributed in important ways to the visual arts remains not very widely known, especially, ironically, among many Catholics today who appreciate the arts, and including, I venture to say, the kind of good people who show up to lectures sponsored by organizations such as the Catholic Artists Society. So my rather simple purpose tonight is just to make sure that no one in this room is unaware after tonight of some basic history on this front. I always do several commercials when I lecture. So before I get into specifics about particular artists, I want to give you the caveat that I'm not an art historian. I'm just a plain old historian. And I've written 3 books so far, all of them historical monographs. And one of them, my second book, is a biography of the 17th century French Duchess, aptly titled La Duchesse. And I had to get into a bit of art history to write this biography, because my subject, Marie de Vignerot, the remarkable niece and heiress of the French Prime Minister, Cardinal Richelieu, was, among her many other accomplishments that I discovered in the archives and other sources, she was an avid patroness and collector of art, as her famous uncle was before her. Cardinal Richelieu, in fact, is considered the first major private art collector in European history. Now, among her paintings known to have hung in her home in Paris was Nicolas Poussin's classically inspired painting, The Abduction of the Sabine Women, circa 1634, and it hangs today nearby at the Met uptown. I'm sure some of you here have seen it even. The Duchess of Aiguillon was also, I learned, the patroness of an artist not so well known today, McShea, who did some remarkably realistic portraits, such as the 2 on the screen that I put there, from the mid-1600s, and he did those before traveling to Asia with some Catholic missionaries that the Duchess was funding. Now, it's unclear what happened to Sweerts, but he appears to have died in 1664 somewhere in India. Now, although I'm not an art historian, I am, I confess, a bit of an artist myself. I have not devoted the time to drawing and painting that I might have done over the years, but up on the screen are samples of my work. And I bring this up not just to indulge myself with the momentary thrill of showing some of my artwork to an artsy audience in the ritzy Chelsea neighborhood, but also to bring up the point that when I was quite young, growing up Catholic in upstate New York, and I found myself very drawn both to traditional styles of drawing and painting, and to the idea of maybe becoming a serious artist myself one day, I struggled a bit with what seemed to be the stark reality that hardly any women had been artists in the time periods that I love to study. Whether they had, so hardly any women, it seemed, had been artists in the days of the old masters, whether they had wanted to be or not. So figures such as Caravaggio, Velázquez, and others that I grew up admiring and even trying to imitate in a teenager's way in my parents' family room as a teenager. These were the artists that spoke to me. I didn't know any female artists, and that mattered to me on some level. It subtly affected my self-perception, my sense of my potential as an artist as well. And I actually faced the same problem when it came to some of the scholarly interests that I developed quite young, and eventually decided to pursue in college and graduate school. There didn't seem to be many women, let alone faithfully Catholic women, among all the great scholars of the past who were held up to me by the church and by my various teachers to get to know and to draw from in various ways in my own work. Now, as the years went by, though, there's another commercial, after I chose to pursue advanced studies and a career in history, and as I began to develop and teach my own history courses and work on my own historical research and publishing projects, I came to see, thanks to many specialized scholars whose work had been inaccessible to me or not yet written when I was younger, that there actually were there were more women, including many faithful Catholic women, among the noteworthy artists of the past. There were also scholars in this vein and other categories of accomplished people in more distant centuries that I just was not exposed to when young. And their stories were a bit hidden from view due to a variety of reasons, including some of the ways that historical narratives have been constructed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and are still influencing not just popular understandings of history, but even the understandings of otherwise very educated and informed people of influence within scholarly circles and among the Catholic Church's leadership. So I decided several years ago to try to do something to change that. So I worked with Ignatius Press to produce my third book, Women of the Church, What Every Catholic Should Know, which came out just last week. Now, the book covers all kinds of women. It's not primarily about artistic women. It's about all sorts of women, from some of the great female doctors of the church to some of the most famous Catholic rulers in history, such as Isabel of Spain and Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. But I wanted to be sure, when I wrote this book, to include some important Catholic women in the arts over the centuries, women that I wish I had known about when I was younger. So what I'd like to do with this lecture is to give you an overview of some of the Catholic women in the visual arts whom I cover briefly in Women of the Church, presenting a basic narrative that will stretch from medieval times to the 20th century. And as I go along, though, I'll say a bit more about some of the figures than I was able to do in the book, and I'll also bring in a few names who did not make it into the book. And among the artists I'll go into some detail about here are the Renaissance-era painter Attila Nelli, the 19th century Swiss painter and art patroness Emily Linder, and the American-born sculptor Edmonia Lewis, who spent most of her latter years in Europe, where she died in 1907. And as I go along, I'll offer you all a few suggestions for further reading, as I'm drawing from the specialized work of other scholars for this presentation. So when we get to the Q&A, I may not be able to answer as deeply as some of you might want to ask me about, but we'll see what you guys throw at me. So, any overview of Catholic women who contributed to the visual arts over the centuries has to begin with a discussion of early Christian monasticism. As early as the 6th century, for example, Saint Radegund, a Germanic princess from Thuringia, who had been forced at the age of 10 to marry a Frankish king named Clotaire, who went on to kill her brother and, of course, cheat on her with many concubines, established a convent. She was driven to establish a convent, not surprisingly, Holy Cross Abbey, in the French province of Poitiers, after fleeing that dreadful marriage with the help of a good bishop. This was around the year 560 that she established a community of women at this abbey, which was active for 12 centuries until the French Revolution destroyed it in the 1790s. Now, from early on, the nuns of St. Radegund's Abbey were expected to engage not only in prayer and contemplation, but also in reading, writing, and to get to my point here, copying manuscripts and illuminating manuscripts with their own artwork at times. So convents such as Radegund's and many others that appeared throughout Christendom became important as spaces in which women could freely engage at times in literacy, study, and higher arts. So women in convents sometimes wrote poetry, studied theology and philosophy, and painted and sculpted sacred subjects. Nuns, like many monks who did similar work in monasteries, generally engaged in artistic work without any thought of achieving fame for it. It was very rare in medieval times, even for artistic work done by laymen, be signed with artist names or other identifying marks. Nevertheless, the identities of some medieval women who were artistically accomplished are known to us, and one of them was a nun named Enda, that's E-N-D-E, that's how it's typically spelled, who signed her name to the illuminations, including, I think, this stunning depiction of Christ's apostles that I have up on the screen, in a manuscript completed in the year 975 and preserved today at the Cathedral of St. Mary of Girona in Catalonia in Spain. A nun named Guda also signed her name and actually painted a tiny self-portrait in a late 12th century collection of sermons that's preserved today at the Staatsbibliothek in Frankfurt, Germany. And there we have Guda. She wanted people reading this book to know who she was. So this is from the late 12th century. Now, some medieval artwork was the result of collaborative efforts, including among the late 11th century women of the Benedictine community in Bingen in Germany's Rhineland, who were led by St. Hildegard of Bingen, one of 4 female Catholic saints so far to be declared doctors of the Church. Hildegard, who lived from 1098 to 1179, is most famous for her writings on theological matters, her additional writings on medical and other scientific themes, and her poetry and sacred music compositions, which have been studied by scholars such as Sabina Flanagan, whose book, Hildegard of Bingen, A Visionary Life, is one good place to start for those who want to learn more about Hildegard. Now, although Hildegard is not known to have been skilled with paintbrushes herself, scholars do believe that she directed others in painting some remarkable images that represented mystical visions of the heavens and holy beings and their relationship to the created world that she experienced. And among them are a group of 35 miniatures that appear in a very large codex, or a hand-printed book, of Hildegard's collected writings from the end of the 12th century. And these images have been studied by a range of specialists, including Sara Salvadori in her book Hildegard von Bingen, A Journey into the Images. And I have a few more just to show you. I'm not going to go into detail about the individual images. This gives you a sense of this variety of these images. So Salvadori shows that each of the colors, motifs, and other aspects of the illuminations represent aspects of Hildegard's, by extension, other Christians' interior spiritual journey toward God, and also from knowledge to greater wisdom. And Salvadori proposes this and much else besides with reference to Hildegard's written account of her mystical visions, the Scivias, a Latin phrase that comes from Scivias Domini, or know the ways of the Lord, which achieved some renown, including with Pope Eugene III during Hildegard's own lifetime. So this is, I have this sort of drive-by approach to history. We're going to move forward now to the Renaissance. I feel like my goal in life is to just throw as many palatable facts as possible that I can distill in an amount of time I have audiences. So thank you for being here for that. So moving forward in time to the Renaissance, which, as we know, was a great era for the flourishing of the visual arts. It was the era of Michelangelo, Raphael, and so many other great old masters. We find that convents remained important centers of artistic creativity, while women were generally shut out of painters' guilds and similar professional associations that had emerged for artists. So this brings me to the story of Plautilla Nelli. The painting that I'm showing up on the screen of the Blessed Mothers and other saints' lamentation of Christ after the crucifixion is one of Plautilla Nelli's works, and it's in the San Marco Museum in Florence today. Now, Plautilla Nelli was born in Florence in 1524, at the time that Michelangelo and Raphael were already active as artists. And she lived to the age of about 54 in 1588. She's been studied recently by, among others, Jonathan Nelson in his book on her published, in his book about her published in 2008. So I'm now showing two more of her paintings on the screen, as well as a small portrait of her by another artist. I'm not sure who painted that, but it's believed to be Botticelli, the smaller image there. So the other larger images are two more of her known paintings. One is a depiction of St. Catherine of Siena. The other is an altarpiece depiction of the first Pentecost, or the day when the Holy Spirit descended upon the first apostles of Christ. And I note how Nelly puts the Blessed Mother and other women in the center of the sacred scene, which can be seen in the Church of San Domenica in Perugia. And so she was actually known outside of Florence in her lifetime. She painted, she had commissions outside of Florence. Now, Nelly was born into a wealthy family of merchants, and she entered a convent of Dominican nuns. This was the convent of Santa Caterina in Florence, and she was 14 at the time, and her artistic talents were apparent from an early age. But as a woman, she could not formally train as a master painter. She could not join any artistic guilds. So she had to learn to paint on her own, in any way that she could, and as a member of the Dominican women's community in Florence, she was actually able to develop her skills partly by studying the works of many other artists that hung all around her in various Florentine churches. And in time, she taught other women how to paint, and she led an artistic workshop out of her convent. And under Nelly's direction, the workshop drew in revenues from commissions and sales, which helped to sustain the community financially. So she was a bit of a businesswoman as well. Now, because Nelly was a woman and a Dominican vowed to chastity, she was unable to learn how to paint human figures, especially male figures, from live models, as male artists regularly were doing by that time. You couldn't very well have a Dominican nun show up in an artist workshop with nude models around. It just would not have flown in those days. These days, you don't have anything like that. But it's all the more impressive that she achieved works such as the Lamentation of Christ painting that I showed you a moment ago. And also this one up on the screen. This is Botticelli's Last Supper, painted with some of the assistants that she had trained. And it can be seen today inside the Basilica of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. And it's 23 feet long and 6 feet high. As far as we know, Nelly was the first female artist to have taken on the theme of the Last Supper. Now, I'd like to add that Nelly's achievements were respected by her contemporary, Giorgio Vasari, the author of the famous book, Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. And while Nelly was still alive and active as an artist, Vasari said that she might have achieved real greatness on the level of some of the best artists of the day, had she been permitted to study in the ordinary ways that aspiring male artists could at that time. Now, unfortunately, later generations of art critics, historians, museum curators were less appreciative than Vasari and other 16th century figures who knew Nelly. So the Uffizi Museum in Florence did not exhibit her work as such until 2017, as far as I'm aware. And this was only after an American foundation, Americans always causing trouble on the go, Advancing Women Artists, which became active in Florence about a decade before that, began to encourage greater recognition of and sponsor the restoration of a number of Nelly's works. So the picture of the Last Supper here is a restored version. For many years it was kind of dull and dark and not fully appreciated for how colorful and beautiful it is. So the restoration of some of her works was sponsored by this organization, Advancing Women Artists, that has since actually, I think, closed its doors during the pandemic. And other women artists of the Renaissance era, their work achieved some greater renown and restoration due to the work of such organizations. Now, Tautilla, Nelly, and her workshop helped to open up new possibilities for other artistic women, including some talented Catholic lay women who did not have to do their work cloistered away in convents, but were able to develop more public careers despite the continued restrictions on women generally when it came to professional training as artists. And one example is Lavinia Fontana, an Italian Mannerist painter from Bologna who lived from 1552 to 1614. Her self-portrait of 1577, up on the left side, today viewable in the Accademia di San Luca in Rome, depicts her at the clavichord with a servant behind her, so it projects an image of wealth and respectability. Her father, a prominent teacher of painting in Bologna, flouted conventions and decided to train his daughter in painting when he realized her talents. So some of the women who did achieve careers in this period, it was often due to the kind of the appreciation of their father's teaching them. So in time, she was able to build a career, and it seems that she was the first European woman to be able to do this as a painter who was regularly commissioned. She married a man named Gianpaolo Zappi, who served as her agent, and together the two built up a successful business while raising a large family. While many of her commissions were portraits of wealthy Italian noblewomen, she also was commissioned to do various sacred images, such as the beautiful depiction here of Christ and the penitent woman at the well. It's up on the screen. It's today in a private collection. But clearly I found a pirated image online of it. I'm not sure about the private collection. I should know that here. Now she did altarpieces as well. So it was rare for women to do altarpieces, but Fontana occasionally did altarpieces. And this one here on the right is one of these. It depicts the Assumption of the Virgin, and it was completed by Fontana in 1593. And it's inside the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. Now, Fontana and her family moved to Rome in 1604, where those who patronized her career included Pope Clement VIII and Pope Gregory VIII. So there were some popes who recognized the talent in this period. She became an official portraitist at the Vatican, and she earned a number of medals and other honors by the end of her life, including admission into the Accademia di San Luca in Rome, an Italian academy for artists that had been founded in 1577. Now, looking later in time to the Baroque period in Spain, where not just women's paintings, but everyone's paintings start to get florid and colorful and interesting, we find lay Catholic artists such as Josefa de Olidos from Seville, who, like Fontana, was born into a family of artists. And Josefa de Olidos lived from around the year 1630 to 1684, and she learned how to paint from her father, and also from Augustinian nuns at a convent where she received some schooling for a few years. Now, over time, while never marrying nor becoming a nun herself, she was able to earn a living by painting various altarpieces, other works commissioned by churches and monasteries, and also painting portraits and still life paintings as well. Most of this work was done in Portugal, where she and her family had moved. And some of her work was done for the University of Coimbra in Portugal. So up on the screen are several of her works. Her Holy Family with St. John the Baptist, 1678. It's actually in the Detroit Institute of Arts today. And also her Penitent Magdalene, 1679, which is owned by the Louvre in Paris. And I meant to show you one of her still life paintings, still life with sweets from around 1679. I seem to have forgotten it, so it was quite delightful. So I'm sorry, I didn't give you a sense of the variety of what she did. You had enough food though, so you're going to see that screen. Now, a contemporary of Josefa de Olidos was Luisa Ignacia Roldán, who lived from 1652 to 1706. Her father, there's a theme here, her father, the sculptor Pedro Roldán from Seville in Spain, recognized her talent and let her apprentice in his workshop alongside a young man with the surname Los Arcos, whom she went on to marry, not with her father approving of that choice. The artistic couple went on to establish a successful sculpting workshop, and Luisa herself was actually the principal sculptor, and her husband actually handled much of the painting and gilding of the sculptures, which was done very often with sculptures in this period, especially in Spain. So she was recognized as the more superior sculpting talent of the two, and the two made a business out of this. She was the mother of 7 children, and despite that, she achieved a great deal as a sculptor of numerous works, such as the Virgin of Solitude of 1688 at the Iglesia de la Victoria in Puerto Real, and the Lactating Virgin of the late 17th century, which is today at the Museum of Fine Arts in Seville. And she was actually recognized at the time of her death by the Accademia di San Luca in Rome. So this is another theme. Often these women were recognized in their day. They were forgotten after their time. It's not that they were unappreciated in their day. She was considered by observers in her own time to be as important a sculptor as her father. Now, continuing with my drive-by approach here, I'm going to zoom into the 19th century here. This is a depiction of Basel in Switzerland in the early 19th century. Now, by the early 19th century, in the wake of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, it was, as I hope my lecture is making clear by now, hardly unheard of for women to pursue painting and other visual arts at a high level. However, women were still largely discouraged from training in the arts in the same ways that men of talent in these areas could. This was as true in parts of Europe that had long since abandoned the Catholic faith, such as Basel and Switzerland, depicted on the screen, as it was in traditional Catholic countries such as France and Spain. The next Catholic, or eventually Catholic painter that I'd like to spend a bit of time on, and one who interests me actually for another project I have in mind, for a book I hope to write, grew up as a Protestant in the city of Basel, but eventually she converted to Roman Catholicism. And for reasons that were intertwined in interesting ways with her development and interests as an artist over time, her conversion was kind of intertwined with some of her artistic developments. Her name was Emily Linder, and she lived from the year 1797 to 1867. Now, this portrait of Linder from 1855, when she was in her late 50s, she looked like she had a good skin routine. Was done by her friend and fellow female artist Rosalie Wieland-Rothmann, and it hangs in Basel's main art museum, or she just had a good friend. So there's not actually much on Linder and her work in English. So I've only been able to consult some online resources about her that are minimal, as well as a German language book of scholarly articles on her that I was able to check at the Columbia Library before all hell broke loose at Columbia. It's edited by Patrick Brown and Axel Christoph Gump, and it was published in Basel in 2013. And I've also gotten to see several of Linder's paintings in person last year in Basel in a visit to the Basel Art Museum. Now, that museum's collection includes the 2 paintings that I'm showing you here. The first is a depiction of the Blessed Mother and the Christ Child, which she completed in 1817 when she was only 20 years old. So this is an early example of her religious interests. So she was a young Protestant woman, barely a woman. She painted a Virgin and Child. And then the second painting I have on the screen, she painted much later. It's a portrait of a German baroness named Auguste von Eichtal, and she painted that nearly 4 years later. Now, Linder is an interesting figure. She was able to train as an artist in Munich, outside of her own country, and to develop a career in Germany, alongside some other female artists in the early and mid-19th century. She did so at the encouragement of her maternal grandfather, who was a textile manufacturer, and this was after she was orphaned at 15. So she had some resources from her grandfather, and he encouraged her to train in the arts. So she went to school in Germany. In her late 20s, she left Switzerland for Munich, and although she was not permitted to formally study at the Academy of Fine Arts there because she was a woman, she was able to receive extensive training from artists there, including Joseph Schlotthauer, her main mentor. Now, 2 of the artists she got to know in Munich were older men who tried to get her to marry them, but she chose to remain single her whole life. I don't know what the story was there, but I hope to find out at some point. Early in her career, she was able to spend quality time in Rome and to study the artwork in various churches and museums there. Now in Rome, this is not one of her paintings, in Rome, Linder was exposed to a movement of German Romantic painting called the Nazarene movement. They were called Nazarenes by their detractors, actually, because they dressed in a style that is seen as an affected, biblically inspired mode. So they're sort of mid-19th century Christian hippies or something. Their primary aim, which was a reaction against the highly classical styles of painting that dominated the formal institutes of art education at the time throughout Europe, was to seek inspiration from medieval and early Renaissance art that, in their view, was much more of an embodiment of Christian spiritual principles. Now, unsurprisingly then, Nazarene artists painted sacred subjects a lot, but in ways inspired by the Romanticism that was culturally influential in the early 19th century more broadly. So we can see this in the example of a Nazarene painting that I chose to put up on the screen for you. This is a depiction of the biblical Jacob meeting Rachel, and it's painted by an artist named Joseph von Fürich from 1836, and it's found today in the Gallery Belvedere in Vienna. So Linder was exposed to the Nazarene paintings. Many of them were in this style or somewhat similar to this, including the subject matter and the like. So to get a sense, this is not the most developed painting that I was not able to get good color images of her work in time for this lecture. But this gives a sense of a painting she was working on, a drawing actually first, and then a painting depicting the awakening of Jairus' daughter by Christ. And the drawing and the painting are from around 1831. Now, Linder's own work was influenced by the Nazarene movement. And in time, some of the directions that her artwork was taking, as she reflected more and more on sacred subjects, influenced her decision to become a Catholic in 1843. This was a big step for her as a member of a wealthy family from very Protestant Basel. Now, much of Linder's later work was on sacred themes and done as altarpieces and other works for churches, and she often did not sign them, which has made studying her overall work a bit difficult, because it's not always been clear which works are hers. Now, Linder, in her later years, I also bring her up for this reason, she contributed a great deal to the arts back home in Basel, in Switzerland, after her Catholic conversion. And she did so as a major art collector and as a patroness of both the Basel Art Museum and the traditionally marginalized Catholic community of that city. So beginning in 1847, Linder began to donate paintings to Basel, many of them by Nazarene artists, that she was collecting in Europe. By 1859, she had donated so many paintings to the city of Basel that officials determined that a new building was needed for the Basel Art Museum. This is the foundations of today's Basel Art Museum. To Catholics in her home city, she gifted out of her wealth the construction of the first Catholic church built in Basel since before the Protestant Reformation, several centuries earlier. And I was actually able to visit that church last year, the last time I was in Europe, and the two photos of the church as it is today are my own photos. That drawing up on the left is a depiction of Swiss guys at the Basel Art Museum in its old days. I tried to find somebody to walk in all the time. Now, Linder, I should add, was sometimes dismissed as an unimportant artist and patroness in the decades after her death, due especially to some prejudiced views about Roman Catholics that prevailed in Basel at that time. In recent decades, however, she has received more respectful attention by scholars and museum curators within and beyond Switzerland. Now, the final female artist, so we're getting home stretch here, thank you all. The final female artist I would like to focus on, a female Catholic artist, she faced a great deal more discrimination than Linder. This was Edmonia Lewis, the American sculptor that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. Lewis was born in 1844 in upstate New York and died in London in 1907, where she was buried at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery. faced many challenges during her lifetime, due both to her African and Native American Ojibwe heritage and due to her decision to pursue an artistic career as a woman at a time when it was still not all that socially acceptable in some circles on either side of the Atlantic, although it was becoming more so by this time for women to do this. Now, Lewis's life and career have been studied by various scholars in recent years, including Kirsten Pine Buick in her 2010 book, Child of the Fire, Mary and William Lewis, and the Problem of Art History's Black and Indian Subject. Her life was a highly itinerant one. As a child and young woman, she lived in various places, including Newark, New Jersey, Oberlin, Ohio, where she was able to enroll in Oberlin's Collegiate Institute, which became Oberlin College. The Civil War was going on during her time in Ohio, and as a student there, she faced serious difficulties due to racial prejudice against her, including at one point being badly beaten by attackers who were not prosecuted, and then herself being accused falsely of several crimes while she was recovering. Now, by this point in her life, she was determined to become a sculptor at a high level, and she wanted to earn a living as a sculptor. At around the age of 20, she moved to Boston to keep improving her sculpting skills. And she was able to find a supportive mentor there, the sculptor Edward Augustus Brackett, who received sculpture commissions from various prominent abolitionists of the era. Now, some of Lewis's early works, sculpted in marble, include a portrait bust of the Native American figure Hiawatha, which was inspired by a famous poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and which is owned by the Met here in New York, as well as the dramatic sculpture commemorating the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War, entitled Forever Free, which is owned by the Howard University Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Now, early in her career, Lewis traveled to Rome, partly to study art there, obviously, has a lot of art in Rome, and partly to find a more welcoming home, as both a Black woman and as a Catholic, than she was finding in the United States. She spent most of her career in Rome, although toward the end of her life, she spent several years in Paris and then at the end in London. Having become a Catholic most likely when she was a young teenager, historians are not quite sure when she became Catholic, and certainly when she was very young. She liked to sculpt sacred-themed pieces, including many depictions of the Virgin and Child. Now, on the screen are two sculptures that she completed in 1875. One is a depiction of the biblical slave woman Hagar, and the other is a direct copy of Michelangelo's famous statue of Moses. And both of these are in the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. today. Sorry. There was another sculpture of hers I was going to show you, but I seem to have forgotten it. Now, while she was based in Rome and never married, although it seems she was engaged at one point, Lewis achieved great success as a sculptor, earning several commissions as high as $50,000 in the 1870s. The US dollar was worth about 28 of today's highly inflated dollars, so you can do the math. $50,000 in the 1870s, that's a lot of money. So she was actually setting some record in terms of her commissions, despite the challenges of her, who she was, basically. She was asked to participate in the Great Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, and she sculpted a monumental depiction of the death of Cleopatra, which I'm sorry I meant to show you, and I somehow forgot it on the slideshow. You can look up Edmonia Lewis, Death of Cleopatra. Feel free to look at your phones if you want to. And it's regarded as the finest American sculpture that was in that exhibition. The following year, the President of the United States, Ulysses Grant, asked her to sculpt his portrait, which she did, the result being very much to his satisfaction. I could not find a good image of that online, so I don't have that for you here. Now, when Lewis died in 1907, the neoclassical mode of sculpture that she loved and she cultivated, and that many other artists in time were involved with, had by that point fallen generally out of favor with many elites in Europe and North America. And so, despite her long success in her career, she died in some obscurity, just because of new trends in the art world in part. As with other artists that I've covered in this lecture, her legacy has been revived in recent decades, partly as a result of greater attention being given to female artists of the past, and also, in her case, an African-American artist. Lewis's legacy also received some new attention in the British Isles about 9 years ago, when this bust of Christ that she'd done in Rome in 1870 was taken out of a cabinet in a Scottish noble family's home, Mount Stewart, in which it apparently had just been sitting, hardly noticed, for more than a century. There's probably a lot of odds and ends in the giant Scottish home, hiding in cabinets. So that image of a fine work of art, the portrait of Christ, hiding in plain sight for more than a century, but now lovingly on display in the entranceway of Mount Stewart, I think is a good one to end the lecture with. Because many fine and interesting female Catholic artists from over the centuries had been, in a sense, hiding in plain sight for sometimes much longer than a century. But for various reasons, attention and appreciation, although sometimes given to them in their own lifetimes, waned a great deal in the years between their time periods and our own. And I'm glad that various scholars, curators, and art aficionados have been laboring to correct some of that neglect. Now, I go back to the time when I was growing up Catholic and interested in becoming an artist. I wish I had known about some of the women that I told you about this evening when I was a girl. Who knows if it would have affected how I looked around talent and interests, but it might have. But I became a historian, and a historian who doesn't actually like counterfactuals too much, so we won't speculate about that too much. But there are other artists that I have not even brought into this discussion, such as Gwen John, Welsh artist Carol Houselander. There are others I could have brought into this. So I just wanted to give you an overview, and who knows, if I had known about some of these artists when I was younger, it might have affected some decisions in there, who knows. But as I said, I became a historian. So I'll simply say that I'm very glad that I know about these women now, and at a time in my life when I have this opportunity and ability to communicate to audiences about them through my writing and my public speaking engagements like this one. And I hope that some of these women might even now inspire some of the work, artistic, cultural, educational, and so on, that you or others in your life become involved in. So it's been my honor to tell you about these artists this evening, and I'll be very happy to answer some questions as I can, as best as I'm able over the next few minutes. So thank you.